The silence in my apartment had become a physical thing, a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. It pressed against my eardrums, amplified the hum of the ancient refrigerator, and made the ticking of the clock on the wall sound like hammer blows. I traced the condensation ring a forgotten coffee mug had left on the worn laminate of my desk. Another Tuesday, another day of staring at screens, parsing data that felt increasingly meaningless. I used to love this. The vast, silent canvas of the cosmos, the elegant dance of celestial bodies, the sheer, overwhelming scale of it all. Now it just felt empty, a grand, indifferent stage for a drama I no longer cared to watch. My colleagues at the observatory called it burnout. I called it clarity. The universe, it turned out, was mostly just physics, predictable and ultimately, disappointingly mundane. No grand pronouncements, no hidden meanings, just laws and probabilities. I pushed away from the desk, the worn casters of my chair groaning in protest. The apartment was small, cluttered with stacks of books on astrophysics, a few I hadn't touched in years, their spines cracked and faded. A telescope, once my pride and joy, now gathered dust in the corner, a monument to a passion I'd let gutter out. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper, and a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. I'd tried everything to get rid of it, but it clung stubbornly, a phantom odor in my personal void. My gaze drifted to the window. Even here, miles from the observatory, the sky was a familiar, if muted, spectacle. Tonight, though, something was off. A faint, ethereal glow pulsed on the horizon, a sickly green that didn't quite match the usual aurora borealis. It was too steady, too low. The observatory's remote monitoring station, the one I'd set up years ago out of a lingering, stubborn curiosity, was located far north, a place built for a singular purpose, to observe the weather station, aurora behaving wrong. It was a relic, mostly automated now, a place I hadn't visited in person for what felt like an eternity. I'd always kept it running, a small, private outpost of my former self, tucked away in the desolate expanse. A jolt, sudden and sharp, ran through me. It wasn't just the aurora. The data feed from the station, usually a steady stream of atmospheric pressure, wind speed, and spectral analysis of the northern lights, had been glitching for the past few days. Not random errors, but something, patterned, a persistent anomaly in the background radiation readings. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to equipment malfunction or solar interference, but the pattern was too regular, too deliberate. My fingers, almost of their own accord, found their way to the keyboard. The old terminal, a dinosaur by modern standards, booted up with a series of wheezing clicks. The interface was rudimentary, lines of green text on a black background, a stark contrast to the sleek modern systems at the observatory. But I knew it, every command, every quirk. I navigated through the diagnostic logs, my breath catching in my throat. The anomaly wasn't in the aurora itself. It was something else. A faint, impossibly complex signal buried deep within the static. It was structured, intelligent. My heart, which I'd thought long dormant, began to thrum against my ribs. This wasn't solar flares. This wasn't atmospheric interference. This was something else. The sector of space it originated from was designated as a null zone, a vast, unremarkable stretch of nothingness. I zoomed in on the spectral analysis. The signal wasn't broadcasting on any known frequency. It was a resonance, a ripple in the very fabric of space-time, detected only by the most sensitive instruments I'd painstakingly calibrated myself. The data points formed a sequence, an intricate alien grammar I couldn't begin to decipher. It was beautiful in a terrifying, primal way, like looking at a fractal pattern that threatened to swallow I whole. This wasn't the predictable, elegant universe I'd once adored. This was something ancient, something vast, and something that was now reaching out. The weather station. Aurora behaving wrong was just the messenger, a lonely sentinel in the frozen north, picking up a signal that had no business existing. The signal pulsed again, stronger this time, a distinct modulation that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't random noise. It was a call, but who or what was calling, and why from a place that was supposed to be utterly devoid of anything? The air in my apartment suddenly felt thin, inadequate. The stale smell seemed to deepen, taking on a new, acrid edge. I stared at the screen, at the impossible data, my mind struggling to grasp the implications. The universe wasn't empty, it was inhabited, and the inhabitants were not what I or anyone had ever imagined. The faint green glow outside my window seemed to intensify, a sickly beacon in the encroaching night. Was it merely a coincidence, this strange aurora, or was it somehow connected to the signal? The silence didn't break. It just shifted. The refrigerator's drone deepened, a low thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards. My own breathing felt too loud, a ragged counterpoint to the oppressive quiet. I'd spent hours staring at the screen, the anomalous signal a jagged scar across the data stream. It was there, undeniable yet utterly impassable. My fingers, stiff from inactivity, hovered over the keyboard. The signal wasn't just a frequency, it was a pattern, an intricate, repeating sequence that defied any known astrophysical phenomenon. I'd run every diagnostic, every filter, every algorithm I knew. Each time the result was the same, an impossible signature, broadcasting from a patch of space that, according to every star chart, every survey, was nothing. Empty. I pushed away from my desk, the cheap office chair groaning in protest. The coffee mug's condensation ring was still there, a pale ghost on the worn laminate. I remembered pouring that coffee, the bitter aroma filling the air, a mundane ritual that now felt like a lifetime ago. The signal had consumed everything since then. Sleep, food, the simple act of existing in the present. I needed to verify. I needed another set of eyes, even if those eyes belonged to someone who would, no doubt, dismiss me as a crackpot. The thought made my jaw tighten. I hadn't slept properly in days. But the signal, it was real. I could feel it in my bones, a resonant frequency that had lodged itself deep within me. My old colleague, the one who still worked up at the weather station, the one who'd always been grounded, practical, the one who'd once called my theories fascinating flights of fancy. He was the only one I could think of. The weather station, aurora behaving wrong. It was remote, isolated, perfect for getting away from the city's noise, and it had the equipment. Decent anyway. Enough to cross-reference. I grabbed my jacket, the worn canvas rough against my skin. The air outside was sharp, biting. The sky was a bruised purple, the first hint of dawn bleeding over the horizon. The drive felt longer than usual. Each mile that separated me from the city, from the familiar, felt like a step into something less defined, less solid. The weather station, aurora behaving wrong, stood stark against the pale sky. It was a cluster of utilitarian buildings, their metal skins dulled by years of wind and snow. A single light glowed in one of the windows. I parked my car, the crunch of gravel under the tires unnervingly loud in the stillness. The door opened before I even knocked. The station chief, a man whose face was a roadmap of weathered lines, stood silhouetted in the doorway. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took me in. "Dean, didn't expect you out this way. Bad omens, that signal of yours." His voice was a low rumble, laced with amusement. He always had a way of cutting through my more esoteric pronouncements. "Something like that," I admitted, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, a faint but persistent hum emanating from the banks of equipment that lined the walls. "I need to borrow some time on your array, Chief. Got something unusual I need to verify." He gestured with a calloused hand towards a console, its screens displaying a chaotic dance of weather patterns. "Unusual is your middle name, Dean. What is it this time? Aliens building a space station out of pure thought?" I ignored the jab, my gaze already fixed on the secondary monitors. "No, it's a signal, coming from deep space, but it's wrong." I sat down, my fingers finding the familiar keys. The chief watched me, his earlier amusement fading into a cautious curiosity. I began to explain, detailing the impossible bandwidth, the non-random fluctuations, the sheer presence of it. As I spoke, I pulled up the raw data from my own equipment, the jagged lines a stark contrast to the smooth, predictable curves of standard stellar emissions. "See," I pointed to a particularly dense cluster of peaks. "This isn't natural, it's too ordered, too deliberate, and it's originating from a sector that's supposed to be empty." The chief leaned closer, his brow furrowed. He was a man of science, of observable phenomena. He understood pressure systems, solar flares, the subtle shifts in the ionosphere, but this was outside his purview. "Empty space doesn't broadcast, Dean," he said, his voice softer now, "unless something is putting it there." "Exactly, it's not like anything we've ever encountered." I zoomed out, showing the signal's projected origin point, the empty sector. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the screen. The hum of the station seemed to deepen, to take on a more insistent rhythm. Outside, I noticed the aurora was beginning to stir. Not the gentle, rippling curtains of light I was used to seeing, but something more erratic, more violent. The colors were too bright, too sharp, pulsing with an unnatural intensity. They flickered and writhed like a wounded thing. "That's not right," the chief murmured, his eyes flicking towards the window. "The aurora, it's behaving wrong." I felt a prickle of unease. The signal, the impossible origin, and now this. The world outside, the predictable dance of celestial bodies, was starting to unravel. The aurora, a phenomenon I'd always found beautiful, now seemed menacing. To what, Dean? What the hell are I picking up? The aurora outside flared, a blinding burst of emerald and violet that painted the sky in stark, unnatural hues. It was a silent scream, a visual distortion that felt more like a tear in reality than a display of atmospheric physics. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of my instruments, that impossible signal continued to broadcast, a beacon from a place that shouldn't exist, a place that was now, I suspected, reaching out. Was this the beginning of its attention? Was the aurora just the first tremor? The aurora outside flared, a blinding burst of emerald and violet that painted the sky in stark, unnatural hues, and somewhere far beyond the reach of my instruments that thing pulsed. I rubbed my eyes, the grit of exhaustion clinging to my lids. The constant hum of the servers in the main control room of the weather station, aurora behaving wrong, was a low thrum against the silence of my own thoughts. Outside, the light show continued its frenetic dance, far too vigorous for this latitude, far too wrong. It had been like this for 3 days, ever since the signal had first registered. The signal, that was the real problem. It wasn't just anomalous, it was a perfect repeating sequence of prime numbers, mathematics, pure, unadulterated mathematics, broadcasting from a void where nothing should exist. Just nothing and the signal. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the waveform with a trembling finger. It was beautiful in its stark, mathematical purity, a stark contrast to the chaotic, violent hues bleeding across the sky outside. I'd spent the last 72 hours locked in here, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a desperate, gnawing curiosity. My colleagues, the few remaining personnel at this remote outpost, had given me a wide berth. They chalked up my obsession to stress, to the isolation, to the unnerving spectacle overhead. They were wrong. This wasn't stress. This was revelation. I'd been running decryption algorithms, brute-forcing every known cipher, every hypothetical alien communication protocol I could conceive of. Nothing. It was too clean, too pure. The numbers themselves were the message. But what were they saying? Then a flicker, a subtle deviation in the pattern, almost imperceptible, a single aberrant pulse. It was like finding a misplaced comma in a sacred text. My heart, which had been a dull, heavy weight in my chest for days, gave a sudden, sharp lurch. I isolated the anomaly. It was a pause, a break in the perfect stream. And in that fraction of a second, the entire sequence shifted, not in its mathematical integrity, but in its context. It was like a key turning in a lock. The numbers weren't a message to us. They were a message about us, or rather about the space between us. I keyed in a new set of parameters, a desperate gamble based on this single, alien punctuation mark. The server's word, their fans kicking into a higher gear. The lights in the control room seemed to dim, as if the very air was being leached of its energy. Outside, the aurora pulsed brighter, a furious, silent roar. The screen flickered, data streamed in, raw and unfiltered. I watched, my breath catching in my throat. Coordinates, not celestial coordinates, but something far more fundamental. They pointed to a location not in space, but in the structure of space itself. A point of convergence, a nexus. And the signal wasn't originating from a star or a planet or even a rogue asteroid. It was emanating from a place that, according to every map, every survey, every scrap of astronomical data I possessed, simply did not exist. An absolute perfect vacuum. But the signal was there, and it was powerful. The numbers, they were describing a geometry I couldn't comprehend. Angles that didn't add up, dimensions that shouldn't exist. It was a blueprint not of a place, but of a state of being that defied the very laws of physics as I understood them. Then a new packet of data arrived, piggybacking on the main signal. It was different, not numbers, images, fragmented, distorted like a shattered mirror reflecting something impossible, shapes that twisted and writhed, colors that had no name, and a feeling, a profound, suffocating sense of wrongness. It was the feeling of something vast and ancient stirring, something that had no business being awake. The temperature in the control room plummeted. It was an internal shiver, a primal response to the sheer, unadulterated alienness of what I was seeing. The aurora outside seemed to synchronize with the flickering images on the screen, its unnatural hues mirroring the impossible colors I was witnessing. I looked at the coordinates again, the impossible nexus. It wasn't a transmission. It was a resonance, a vibration emanating from a place that shouldn't be. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the exterior of the weather station. It sounded like ice breaking, but far too loud, far too deep. My eyes snapped to the reinforced window, but the aurora's blinding glare obscured anything beyond. What was resonating, and why was it suddenly so loud, thing, was growing. I stood at the reinforced window of the weather station, aurora behaving wrong. The chill seeping through the thick glass doing little to cool the fever in my blood. My breath misted the pain, obscuring the impossible light for a moment. When it cleared, the colors seemed to writhe, to twist with a malevolent intent I couldn't articulate. It wasn't just light, it was a presence. It felt like the sky itself was a canvas being smeared by a colossal, unseen hand. My fingers, raw and chapped from the biting wind, traced the condensation. The signal. It had to be the signal. The anomaly I detected, the rhythmic pulse originating from a void that should have been empty. It wasn't just a radio wave, it was a lure. And I, in my hubris, had taken the bait. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that felt too deep to be mechanical. It resonated in my teeth, a subtle tremor that made the equipment on my workbench rattle. The spectrum analyzer, which had been faithfully charting the aurora's bizarre electromagnetic signature, suddenly flickered. The steady line representing the anomaly, the one I'd painstakingly isolated, began to distort. It stretched, contorted, as if trying to mimic the violent ballet happening outside. My gut twisted. This wasn't random interference. This was responsive. The raw data on the screen was becoming a chaotic mess of jagged peaks and impossible frequencies. It was as if the very laws of physics were being rewritten, or perhaps simply ignored. I backed away from the window, the hum growing louder, more insistent. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't external. My gaze swept across the cramped interior of the weather station. The familiar instruments, my life's work, now seemed alien, imbued with a sinister aura. The blinking lights of the comms unit appeared like watchful eyes. The static that had been a constant companion now sounded like choked laughter. I needed to get out. I needed to pack up my research, my meager possessions, and drive as far away from this frozen, desolate outpost as my battered Jeep could carry me. But the thought of leaving, it felt like a betrayal of everything I had dedicated my life to understanding. I walked over to the main console, my boots crunching on a fine layer of frost that had somehow accumulated inside. Frost began to bloom on the metal surfaces, delicate, crystalline patterns that seemed to mirror the aurora's erratic dance. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the keys slick with condensation. The primary sensor array, designed to monitor atmospheric conditions, was now picking up something else. Not atmospheric, not geological. It was a complex, multi-layered signature, shifting and evolving with impossible speed. It was like trying to read a language composed of pure sensation, of abstract concepts rendered into raw data. And then, a single word flashed across the main display, overriding all other readouts. It wasn't a word I recognized, not in any language I knew. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the weather station. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My breath hitched, catching in my throat. The glyph pulsed on the screen, each beat synchronized with the growing roar. It was a message, I was sure of it, a declaration. The frost on the window panes began to melt, not from warmth, but from some internal pressure dripping down the glass in thick, viscous trails. I looked at the comms unit, my only link to the outside world. The power indicator was blinking erratically. Could I even transmit? Would anyone believe me? And more importantly, what if my message was received not by a human but by it? The sound reached a crescendo, a tearing, ripping noise that filled the air, accompanied by a sensation of immense pressure building around me. The entire structure groaned, a protest against forces it was never meant to withstand. My eyes darted to the door. Escape was still possible, a desperate, futile flight into the howling blizzard, but the glyph on the screen, It felt like an invitation, a challenge, a glimpse into a reality so vast, so ancient, that my own existence felt like a fleeting spark. The weather station, Aurora Behaving Wrong, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the bars were made of fear. What was this glyph? What did it signify? Thin, place, was still there. It pulsed. I could feel it, a subtle pressure behind my eyes, a phantom chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind whipping around the weather station, Aurora Behaving Wrong. My hands trembled as I adjusted the gain on the array's primary receiver. The anomalous signal, the one that had drawn me to this desolate outpost, was still present. It wasn't just a blip, not a cosmic hiccup. It was a deliberate transmission, ancient and alien, and it was growing stronger. I'd spent weeks here isolated, the biting cold a constant companion, the silence broken only by the howl of the wind and the ceaseless hum of the equipment. Initially, it was a puzzle, a professional obsession. The aurora's erratic dance was no accident, it was a symptom. I pulled up the spectral analysis again. The patterns were unlike anything I'd ever catalogued. Not natural radio waves, not pulsars, not quasars. This was structured, intelligent. But the structure was alien, built on principles I couldn't grasp. It was like trying to read a language composed of colors and emotions, not words. The entity, whatever it was broadcasting its existence, and it was doing so in a way that twisted the very fabric of our reality. The aurora was merely a visual manifestation of its proximity, a tremor in the atmosphere as it neared. My gaze drifted to the dusty bookshelf in the corner, crammed with old meteorological journals and forgotten research papers left by previous occupants. Most were dry, technical accounts of ice formations and wind speeds, but buried beneath them, I remembered finding a few older, more esoteric volumes, the kind of fringe theories and anecdotal evidence that would get I laughed out of any academic conference. I dismissed them at the time, but now I was desperate. I stood, my joints stiff from sitting too long. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots. The faint, metallic tang of ozone, a persistent smell in the air since the aurora intensified, prickled my nostrils. My fingers brushed against brittle paper, scent of decay and old ink filling the air. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound tome, its cover cracked and faded. Anomalous atmospheric phenomena, case studies and unexplained events. The pages felt rough under my fingertips. I flipped through them, my heart thudding a heavy, insistent rhythm against my ribs. Most of it was standard stuff, strange lightning, unusual cloud formations. Then I found it. A chapter titled Auroral Sympathy and Extradimensional Resonance. The author, a Professor Alastair Finch, long dead and largely forgotten, wrote of celestial events that coincided with distortions, not just visual ones, but disruptions in local physics, odd gravitational fluctuations, even temporal anomalies. He theorized about entities existing in dimensions adjacent to our own, whose mere presence could ripple through space-time, manifesting as bizarre atmospheric displays. My breath hitched. He described signals too. Faint, almost imperceptible patterns detected by early radio telescopes, dismissed as interference or equipment malfunctions. But Finch believed they were echoes, deliberate transmissions from these interdimensional beings. He called them the weavers of the veil. He posited that they were not malevolent but simply other. Their existence was a force, and that force, when it brushed against our reality, caused these phenomena. And the aurora. He described it as a scar left by their passage. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough against my palm. This wasn't just some astronomical curiosity. The signal was growing stronger. The aurora was a constant, violent display now, the sky a churning canvas of impossible colors. If Finch was right, if these entities were real, and if they were somehow drawn to my signal, what did they want? Were they trying to communicate, or were they merely passing through? Their very being a threat. A sudden, sharp crackle from the receiver jolted me. The signal had spiked, a jagged, impossibly high peak on the graph. It was accompanied by a low hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate not just in the air, but deep within my bones. Outside, the aurora intensified, the colors bleeding into each other, the emerald and violet now shot through with streaks of an unsettling, sickly yellow. The pressure behind my eyes intensified, a dull ache blooming into a sharp throb. I felt a disorienting sensation, as if the room itself was subtly shifting, the floor tilting beneath my feet. I grabbed the nearest notebook, my pen shaking as I scribbled down the new readings, the bizarre waveform. This was more than just a signal. It was a prelude. Finch had mentioned that when the resonance became strong enough, the veil thinned. What happened when it tore? What lay on the other side, waiting to seep through? The question hung in the air, a suffocating weight, as the unnatural light outside pulsed with a terrifying, rhythmic beat. The air in the cramped observation room of the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, was thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something else, something acrid and deeply unpleasant, like burnt sugar mixed with decay. Outside, the sky was a chaotic smear of bruised purples and sickly greens, the aurora not dancing, but writhing. It pulsed erratically, each flicker like a jolt of static electricity against my vision. I'd seen auroras before, 1,000 times in simulations, dozens in person. This was not natural. This was wrong. My fingers traced the faded inscription on the journal's cover, Captain Elias Thorne, Arctic Expedition 1912. Thorne's words, scrawled in spidery ink, were becoming a terrifying prophecy. He'd written of the lights not as a spectacle, but as a presence. He described them as if they were a vast, conscious entity, its thoughts manifesting as shifting, impossible colors. He'd felt its gaze. I felt it now, a prickling sensation across my scalp, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures outside. The signal, that's what had drawn me here, to this desolate outpost at the edge of the world. A whisper in the cosmic static, too structured, too deliberate to be random. I'd followed it, tracing its origin to this very sector, this very latitude. And then I'd found this place, this abandoned weather station and Thorne's journal. The signal wasn't just a transmission, it was a symptom. The aurora was its symptom. A low hum vibrated through the concrete floor, a sound that seemed to originate from deep within the earth. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic, like the slow, grinding exhalation of something colossal. The lights outside intensified, coalescing into a single, searing point of emerald green directly overhead. The temperature inside the station plummeted. My breath plumed in the air, misting the dusty glass of the observation window. Thorne's journal spoke of sympathetic resonance. He believed the aurora was not just light, but a manifestation of a mind, an ancient consciousness that existed beyond our dimensions. And when that consciousness focused, when it looked, it could exert a tangible influence. The signal was its call. The wrong aurora was its awakening. My hands trembled as I reached for the old radio transmitter, its bakelite casing cold and smooth beneath my touch. The humming intensified, a deep, guttural thrum that made my teeth ache. I found the frequency Thorne had scribbled down, a series of arcane numbers and symbols that looked more like a sigil than a radio setting. My fingers fumbled with the dials, the static crackling louder, sharper now, like 1,000 tiny whips lashing against my eardrums. The emerald light overhead flared, blindingly bright, and for a split second I saw it, not just light, a form, a vast, impossible geometry of shifting planes and impossible angles, a thing that was the aurora. It turned its attention downwards. The humming stopped. It was a vacuum, an absence of everything. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing in on me, stealing my breath. I could feel my own thoughts fragmenting, fraying at the edges. The journal described a fail-safe, a way to broadcast a focused nullification signal, but it required a power source Thorne had never managed to harness. He'd left diagrams, schematics for a jury-rigged amplifier, but the final piece was missing. A conduit, something to channel the raw energy. He'd speculated it needed a direct link to something living, something willing. My gaze fell on my own hand, the skin pale and clammy in the dying light. Thorne had written of a sacrifice, a transfer of vital energy to bridge the gap. The thought made me recoil, a primal instinct screaming at me to run, to hide. But the emerald light was still there, a malevolent eye watching from the heavens. The silence was a prelude. The radio crackled to life, not with static, but with a voice. It wasn't Thorne's. They were the lost, the consumed. Thorne's warning was clear. The entity didn't just influence, it absorbed. The diagrams were crude, but the principle was terrifyingly simple. A direct connection, a willing conduit. The weight of the world, or whatever passed for it out here, pressed down on me. The aurora pulsed, a slow, agonizing beat. The hum was still there, faint, but it vibrated deep in my bones, a counterrhythm to my own frantic heartbeat. Thorne's workshop was a wreck, the air thick with the acrid tang of burnt ozone and something else something metallic and sickly sweet that I couldn't quite place. Twisted wires snaked across the floor like dead vines. The amplifier, Thorne's desperate contraption, lay in a heap of sparking components. It hadn't worked. Of course, it hadn't worked. Nothing ever truly worked when I was staring into the abyss. I stumbled out of the workshop, the heavy steel door groaning shut behind me. The cold bit at my exposed skin, a welcome shock after the stifling heat of the room. My breath plumed in front of me, each exhale a ragged gasp. I was at the edge of the world, it felt like. The tundra stretched out, a desolate, windswept expanse under a sky that was anything but normal. The aurora. It was supposed to be a dance of ethereal light, ribbons of green and violet painting the polar night. But this was wrong. The colors were too vibrant, too sharp, bleeding into one another with a violent intensity. They pulsed, not in a gentle ebb and flow, but in jagged, erratic bursts, like a dying star's final convulsions. It cast the snow-covered landscape in a lurid, shifting glow, making the familiar shapes of the ice ridges twist into something alien and menacing. My eyes traced the unnatural light, a primal unease coiling in my gut. The journal. Thorne had written about the signal, about the entity. He'd believed it was reaching out, not with malice, but with an indifferent curiosity that was far more terrifying. And my actions, my attempt to amplify Thorne's failed defense, had apparently responded. A low thrumming sound began to emanate from the earth itself, a deep resonance that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly into my skull. It was the same hum from the workshop, but magnified, amplified by the vast emptiness around me. The ground beneath my boots felt unstable, as if the very bedrock was shifting. I looked down, my vision blurring for a moment. The snow seemed to shimmer, not from the aurora's light, but from some internal luminescence. My hands clenched into fists, the rough wool of my gloves digging into my palms. I was supposed to have stopped it, or at least contained it, but all I'd done was poke it. Thorne's schematics, the desperate scribbles in his journal, they were meant to be a shield, a way to push back against whatever was out there. Instead, I'd become a beacon. I started walking, not towards the main building of the weather station, but away from it, drawn by an invisible current. The wind whipped around me, carrying a scent I couldn't quite identify. It was like static electricity, but somehow wetter, heavier. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The aurora overhead flared, a blinding wash of sickly yellow that momentarily bleached the world white. When my vision cleared, the landscape had subtly shifted. The ice formations were different. The very contours of the land seemed to have rearranged themselves, as if a giant hand had casually reshaped the world while I wasn't looking. A tremor ran through the ground, stronger this time, rattling my teeth. The hum intensified, a deafening crescendo that threatened to shatter me from the inside out. I stopped, panting, my lungs burning with the frigid air. The aurora had receded, leaving behind a sky of bruised purples and deep, unsettling blacks. But the hum, though quieter, was still there, a constant reminder. It was in the air, in the ice, in me. What had I done? Had I alerted it, or had I merely woken it? Thorne had been trying to sever a connection, not forge one, and I, in my hubris, had just slammed the door open. Was that my name, or just the lament of the ice? The vast, indifferent emptiness of the polar night felt like a conscious entity now, watching me, waiting. And the hum, the maddening, pervasive hum, was the only answer it offered. The static clawed at my ears, a constant, grating whisper that had become the soundtrack to my life. Thorne's workshop was a graveyard of failed experiments, the air still choked with the metallic tang. I ran a gloved hand over a scorched circuit board, its intricate pathways melted into abstract, weeping scars. The hum, though, that was the real problem. It was a physical presence, a low thrumming that resonated not just in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. It was the echo of it. My eyes scanned the readouts on the jury-rigged console. Thorne had been so close, so terrifyingly close. His notes, scrawled in a frenzy across a stack of data pads, spoke of harmonic convergence, of dimensional bleed-through. Words that had once been abstract concepts in my field now felt like primal incantations. He'd been trying to listen, to understand, and in doing so, he'd opened a door. I had to go back to the source. The coordinates were burned into my mind, a phantom imprint on my optic nerve. The old weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, sat on a desolate plateau, a skeletal monument to a forgotten era of scientific optimism. It was the closest terrestrial point to where Thorne's readings had peaked. The drive up was a blur of grit and biting wind. The landscape was already alien, a canvas of bruised purples and ochres under a sky that refused to commit to night or day. As I crested the final rise, the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, loomed. It was a squat, concrete structure, half buried in drifts of snow that looked unnaturally dark, almost viscous, and the sky, it was a spectacle of wrongness. The aurora, usually a graceful dance of light, writhed. It pulsed with a sickly green luminescence, tendrils of color stretching and snapping like phantom limbs. It wasn't a phenomenon, it was a fever dream made manifest. The hum intensified as I approached the station. It was no longer a vibration, it was a pressure pushing against my eardrums, against my very skull. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent that was both ozone and something else, something ancient and damp, like disturbed earth that had never seen the sun. I pushed open the reinforced door. The familiar equipment of a weather station, archaic barometers, anemometers, a defunct radio console was coated in a fine gray dust that seemed to absorb light. But it was the center of the main room that drew my attention. A circular indentation in the concrete floor, as if something immense had once rested there. And etched into the stone, a symbol. It wasn't a language I recognized, but its geometry spoke of impossible angles, of dimensions that shouldn't exist. I activated my portable scanner, the device whirring nervously in the heavy quiet. The readings were chaotic, nonsensical, energy signatures that defied known physics, gravitational anomalies that warped the very space around the indentation. The hum here was a tangible thing, a vibration that made my teeth ache. It was emanating from beneath the floor. My hands, despite the gloves, felt clammy. I knelt, tracing the edges of the symbol with a fingertip. Thorne's notes flashed through my mind, the resonance cascade. It's not a signal, it's an awakening. Awakening, the word sent a tremor through me. What had Thorne awakened? What had I been listening to? The aurora outside flared, a violent pulse of emerald light that momentarily bleached the interior. A low grinding sound like tectonic plates shifting echoed from below. My breath hitched. The indentation in the floor, it wasn't just an etching. It was a seal, and it was cracking. I scrambled back, my boots skidding on the dusty floor. The air itself seemed to warp, colors bleeding into each other, the solid concrete floor rippling like water. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled my head, my chest, my very soul. The grinding stopped. The rippling ceased. The aurora outside had faded to a faint spectral glow. The scanner was silent, its screen blank. The indentation was just an indentation again. The symbol was just a carving, but I knew. Asterisk what I had felt, what I had heard. It was still there, waiting, dormant. The resonance cascade had been a warning, a tremor before the earthquake. I had come here to find answers, to resolve the mystery, and I had. We were infinitesimally small. Our universe was a fragile shell, and something ancient and terrible had pressed against it, felt its presence, and then retreated for now. I stood, my legs trembling. The weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, felt like a tomb. Thorne was gone, consumed by his pursuit, and I was left with the knowledge, the burden of what lay just beyond the veil of our perception. The hum was gone from my bones, but its memory lingered, a phantom vibration. As I walked out into the pale, bruised light, I looked back at the squat concrete building. It stood as a silent sentinel, a marker for a boundary that had been tested. The aurora was still wrong, a lingering testament to the brief, terrifying intrusion. I had closed the door, or perhaps it had simply decided to leave. But the knowledge of what resided on the other side, the sheer, incomprehensible scale of it, would forever be etched into my mind, a cosmic scar that would never truly heal. What if it wasn't truly gone? What if it was merely watching, waiting for the right conditions to press again?